So welcome everybody to NRCC's first webinar in our summer series. I hope everyone can see us right now. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Ben Williamson and I am the Executive Director here at the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. I'm here in Jackson, Wyoming right now at the NRCC's headquarters today. And I'd like to welcome you all to part one of the 6-part webinar series we're just starting today that'll run through the end of September. The title that we're calling it is The Lessons from the Field in a Time of Rapid Change and Crisis. So thank you all for taking the time out of your Thursday to join us. Yeah, it looks like more people are signing on, which is great.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'll just kind of go over a little bit of a background and give some housekeeping, and then we'll just dive right in. So as everyone who is tuned in right here knows, we are living through an unprecedented time in history, especially within the environmental field. And so after a series of conversations with myself and several other research associates, we decided a series of conversations to create a space where we can start to begin to process and make sense of the shifting ground beneath us was appropriate, especially for NRCC, in that we've been doing dialogues and workshops like this within the community and beyond the community for since we've been an organization. So it's been fun to get this going and kind of continue that tradition. Just a few other pieces of information. These conversations are going to happen every other Thursday starting today from noon to 1 Mountain Time. And our schedule for the speakers is on our website, also on our social media platforms. So feel free to go check that out. Everybody is a research associate or a resident expert that will be talking with us. All with diverse experiences and at different places in their careers. We will be recording the session, so if you aren't able to make it today, that will be up on our website and also on our Facebook. Yeah, and a quick note on the format we're planning to take today, as it is a bit unique. We're going to try to keep this as conversational as possible. Basically, we're going to orient each of these conversations around the same 5 questions. I'll pose the question and then give the presenter about 5 minutes to answer the question. We're hoping that sort of allows for some like bounds and parallels in content of speakers so that we can begin to draw lessons across the different conversations. The explicit goal for this conversation and these conversations is to highlight the work of reflective people who are thinking outside the box within the environmental and social fields. And that is very much in line with the work that NRCC has fostered over the years. We'll leave about 25 minutes at the end for Q&A with the audience. So if you have questions, feel free to start typing them into the Q&A and then send them over at the end of Jesse's talk. And then I'll read them out loud and we'll give Jesse a chance to respond. So I think with that, I think that's all the details and framing. I'll just dive right in here. So today's speaker is Jesse Bryant. Thank you for being here, Jesse.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, NRCC broadly. It's a wonderful community that is, supported a really creative project that I've been doing over the past couple months, making a podcast. So thanks so much. Absolutely.
So I'll give a little bit of a background and then let you speak a little bit more broadly on your background. But
okay,
just to frame it, I met Jesse 3 years ago in grad school, and we've stayed close friends since and are working together still closely. Jesse hails from Albany, New York, but has lived for nearly 6 years here in Wyoming. This past fall, the biggest development for his life, I think, is creating a podcast called the Yonder Lies Podcast, along with his co-host, Hannah Haberman. And it's been a really awesome series digging into the sort of surprising and hidden history that the region we're located in here right now has, that being Jackson Hole and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's on KHOL here in Jackson and also on all the pod services. So if you haven't checked it out, I recommend it. Jesse is also an instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School and enjoys the challenge of teaching students in outdoor settings. In May of 2019, Jesse graduated from the Yale School of the Environment, where he did his master's work on a small Wyoming town called Ten Sleep. And while there, he took an integrated approach to understanding the conflict between the rock climbers, the Forest Service, and the local Ten Sleepers. And that was a really fascinating case and has produced some really interesting articles that are out there. This coming fall, Jesse will begin his doctoral work back at Yale FES, or what is now called the Yale School of the Environment, YSE. And he'll focus on some pretty interesting and evolving themes. I'm still like grasping everything that he's going to be doing, and I think he is too, but from my understanding is he's planning on exploring some environmental narratives that exist on online platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, and other places, and teasing out how those discourses set the bounds for politics and public opinion and elite imagination. And so I'm really excited to see the sort of emerging ideas that come from that. So that's all I have. Welcome to Jesse, and I'd like to emphasize how lucky we are to have him here today to learn from and hear from a truly fresh and critical thinker. And so that's the intro. I think we'll just dive right in here.
Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. All right. So, like I said, 5 questions. I'll ask them, give Jesse a chance to respond, and then we'll just keep moving through it. So to just kind of frame the conversation and to start the conversation, in your words, what is sort of the basic outline of the story of how you got to this place in your career and your life, and what do you do now, and why does that work matter to you? So like we're hoping for kind of a personal and reflective tone in these stories, so feel free to take that however you like.
Yeah, okay. And I think like knowing sort of the broad context of like my story, especially academically, like will make more sense sort of where I sort of work I do now. But I have like a really broad and not really disciplinarian background in academia and work. You know, I like studied neuroscience during undergrad and was like pretty head over heels in love with like the brain and sort of the philosophical questions around consciousness and all these kind of funny things. And I was pre-med. I kind of wanted to be a doctor. I rode that wave probably a little too long, I would say. Did some work in international health and politics, and then sort of moved out to Wyoming, like you mentioned. I was in Boston, moved to Wyoming, didn't know anyone out here. Did some work with the National Outdoor Leadership School, where I still teach. I still love that institution. And then I guess 3 years ago now, found myself at the Yale School of the Environment doing a professional environmental management degree that quickly morphed into like kind of a sociology degree that kind of morphed into like a political science thing. And so I sort of have this like really broad background in a bunch of different disciplines. And I wouldn't call myself really an expert to a fault in like anything. But throughout sort of that whole arc of, I guess like my story in relationship to like the academy, I always was sort of, you know, less interested in digging the hole deeper in any discipline, but pretty interested in the process of like how knowledge that's generated by the academy or by like experts or like elites in a field actually like gets used by society. Like that sort of translation process, I guess is what I call it, between the academy and between the academy and society broadly. And obviously like these days that process is a little I don't want to say screwed up, but like contentious. We're living in this like, you know, moment where like what people consider truth is sort of like under attack. And so it's kind of an interesting time for me to enter, you know, a PhD program, which I think most people understand as this 5-year period where, you know, you're supposed to just like go super deep on something. But the thing that I kind of want to go deep on, if this makes sense, is that translation between academia and the public. And so, and also in doing that, like continue to practice. So there's like this term praxis, which is just like applied theory. You know, it's like people are developing theories and like you can embody that work in your own work. And so for me, what that looks like is, you know, continuing to write, continuing to make podcasts, like you mentioned, continuing to participate in like education, like being really concerned with like actually being a good educator, and like being being critical and good about like facilitating spaces, like building conferences in a good way, sort of the broad public humanities, I guess is what people call it, you know, like curation. And so sort of, then that's like the work I've done my whole life. The 10 Sleep project that you mentioned was had the potential to be kind of an academic-y thing, but I never really wanted it to be an academic-y thing. I was way more concerned with like publishing a popular piece about that experience and about what was going on there for a publication, and writing like memos for organizations that to sort of inform policy than I was, you know, trying to publish some master's work that I did in a journal, in an academic journal. And so in some ways I see myself, my like role or like the work I do is this, I think still yet to be defined, almost like ideas doctor role, kind of like the role that a doctor serves in like health, sort of like knowing all the science, knowing you know, anatomy, knowing all these like really, really intensely specific things, that is sort of like multidisciplinary, but then actually like using the fruits of science to in the case of a doctor, increase human well-being. And I sort of see my role similar to that, but in sort of the like idea world of ideas, and particularly like environmental ideas. Right now, I think like probably most people that are watching this are familiar with. There's a lot of, I mean, even a lot of environmental problems, whether it's local problems with like the elk refuge here in Jackson or climate change, like are really contentious, and truths about what is going on and what should be done about it are contentious, and like there's no consensus around action, what's good for everybody. So yeah, I kind of see, I don't know, the work I've always done as a writer, as an educator, and now like going into academia, I've always sort of seen as this like conduit between good knowledge and like supporting politics and just like society broadly. Yeah, that's sort of how I see myself situated right now. I also think it's important, like you mentioned in the intro to this series, like I'm the first speaker in this, and I'm at a particular moment in my career and life and trajectory as just like me, Jesse, a person. Like I'm still pretty young. I'm like starting my career as an academic, starting a PhD program. So I mean, like my story is very much in flux right now. And so some of what I'm saying is a bit aspirational, but I think a lot of what I'm talking about here and what I see my role as has been sort of continuous through the neuroscience phase, the international health phase, the leadership school phase. So yeah.
That's
I don't
really
know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty radically different vision of the degree from an environmental school than most would expect from an environmental school. I feel like the sort of normative path is to get technical skills, to be told that you can solve these problems, and then get placed back out into the world, into these organizations and agencies, and be expected to just like apply those specific technical tools that you learned in school. In reality, like this environmental field is like more of a social field, and it has way more to it than just that sort of simple pathway. So I think it's particularly interesting that you're going into a deep PhD program with that orientation. So
yeah, and it's kind of funny, like I know you know this, but like the incentive structure in academia is like specifically aligned against what I'm talking about, is very much incentivizing digging your hole deeper, go deep into the discipline, add more new knowledge, and that's how you'll be successful. And like I'm not deluded to the point that I don't know that incentive structure works, and that like that will probably affect me as I work through the next 5 to 40 years of my life. But like yeah, I think I'm going to do my best to hold true to the sort of like applied sort of role. Yeah, I don't know.
cool. Yeah, I'm excited to watch your progression through that.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so moving forward to question number two, and a lot of these questions are sort of multi-part questions, and you can answer them how you see fit.
Okay.
So this question, first part is just sort of basic. How has the current pandemic affected your work and you're thinking about what you do, especially like going into school, into a program at school? But I think like it's necessary to take it one step farther because there's much more going on than just a pandemic right now. Um, there's a growing trend of a loss of democratic values within our governance system. There's been dismantling of environmental regulations for the last 4 years. And then this summer, there's been the obvious blatant disregard for human rights and the killing of George Floyd and many other African American citizens, and then all the protests and actions that have ensued. So the question is basically just like, how are you making sense of all these different complex, interconnected crises, and then how are you just positioning yourself within this sort of dynamic world? I think we all have an answer to that, but I'd be curious to hear yours.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first like important, maybe just like nod to my personal, the way that I'm situated in the world right now is that like, I can't imagine a person better situated in the world than myself, like as an individual, to be completely insulated from all of these crises, these like multiple crises than myself. You know, I'm like, grew up in a very loving household, live in Wyoming, like have been accepted into this PhD program at Yale, have a loving partner, like am healthy and 29 years old. So like, I think, yeah, I'm like white, am like not affected by the systemic racism of the policing issues that we've been talking about in this country and broader issues of racism in this country. So I think it's like important for me to acknowledge that the precarity that exists in the world does affect me, but like does not really affect me in an individually like intense way, or as much as other folks. And so, I mean, the honest answer is like, how has this affected my work? It hasn't really. It's pushed me to think about new things and I think forced me to reframe my understandings of a lot of like institutions in this country, et cetera. But yeah, so, but I think like how am I making sense of this moment is more, you know, there's a lot going on, and within the things that I'm particularly interested in, which like is, you know, the creation of knowledge and then like the pragmatic use of that knowledge to make the world better and better for me is, you know, a more equitable world, a more democratic world, a world that is like using natural resources in a sustainable and respectful way. Some particular things that seem to be like in flux right now are, this is really specific, but just the public's access to knowledge is changing in a couple different ways, particularly with big data and sort of the way that we can empirically know things that were once anecdotal, in a way that like feels like this is a truth, is new. You know, really good example is policing, actually, that like we didn't collect data on policing and police violence until basically 2015 after Ferguson. And, you know, there's tons of anecdotal evidence of people in different communities being like, we feel like we're being like policed way harder. We're being like, the violence is being committed by the state to us more than other people. But it was kind of, you know, it was easy to be like, yeah, but like, we don't have any data. We don't like have any empirical evidence of that. And so it's easy to shrug those issues off. And now it's like, we're collecting data on that. We can like see like which I mean, like to see is to like know. We can like see patterns and inequities in society now in a way that's really challenging, I think, our self-awareness as a country.
Mm.
and as a planet, but like specifically in the US. And big data is sort of like, I guess, changing what we can know in a
Mm.
way that I feel like is actually really profound.
Mm.
Um, yeah, in so many different sectors. But there's
Yeah.
also, I mean, the others. What's that?
Keep going.
Oh, did I break up at all?
No, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, so I think like one thing is just the way that we're as a society, the way that we can know things, the way that we can what we can collect as good truth and intelligence
Mm.
we have broader access now
Mm.
on the societal level. There's
Mm.
also, I think, similarly, like the ubiquity of video
Mm.
and our ability to like actually see for ourselves
Mm.
things is I think pretty transformative right now.
Mm.
You know, YouTube's been around for a while. I've been watching YouTube since 2007, 8 when it started, and like I've been kind of a creature of the internet for a long time.
Mm.
Um, but the ubiquity of that is incredible. I mean, there's you know, the question with George Floyd in particular,
Mm.
would this have been a thing if there wasn't a video?
Mm.
And I think that's, you know, my answer to that is like, sadly, no one probably would have, I mean, people would have cared, but like it wouldn't have become this symbolic moment that we're living in
Mm.
if there weren't a video. And the
Yeah.
ability for, you know, some farmer in Iowa to like see for their own eyes what happened to George Floyd
Mm.
over more than 8 minutes is
Mhm.
like a new sort of access to knowing that I think is actually really profound too.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, those are some like two sort of like
Yeah.
epistemological changes that I think are actually like,
I'm wondering what you think, how video and imagery in general could be better leveraged to sort of communicate the severity of the pandemic. Like in a lot of ways, like the like just the horrendous like images of the COVID pandemic, like we haven't really been privy to as often as we were with like Ebola. And so I'm wondering, like, do you think that could actually be a tool that we use to communicate the state of the pandemic, especially literally right now, and how it was different 2 months ago?
yeah. Yeah, well, I think like we're living in this, for me at least, and this is just sort of my standpoint, we're living in a really visual moment.
Mm.
And, you know, even with one of the things that I expect my PhD to be focused on is visual culture online. And a lot of the sociological research about sort of or just environmental discourse is
Mm.
limited to text.
Mm.
And it's actually really limiting in that people every day, uh, especially younger people, are like reading words less, and communication is happening on this visual video level. Memes, these sort of like bizarre media that are like forming and reforming
Mm.
our discourse. And you know, we all know that like political ads are important, and like the sort of propaganda battle that's always going on in our politics is really important. And propaganda, I use that in sort of like a neutral sense, but just sort of people promoting different directions that our society could go in, whether that's policy or,
Mm.
you know, creation of new institutions. And yeah, so I think like, could that be used for good? I think it has, video and media can be used for good, it can be used for bad, but it's kind of like, it's just like language, it's
Mm.
just a different uh, medium. Like
Mm.
it's a different language that I think, especially in the sort of growing digital sociological, computational sociological sort of world, we,
Mm.
like, the academy hasn't done a very good job of understanding yet.
Mm.
And that is despite YouTube being uh, a platform that is so gigantic that we can't even wrap our heads around it. I forget what the number is of like the amount of content on YouTube, or the amount of time the planet spends watching YouTube a day now. It's like
It's like several
longer than
billion hours.
what's
Yeah,
that?
I think it's a billions of hours of every day.
Yeah, yeah, like billions of hours of video are watched, and it's just like a profound. Uh, it feels like a pretty profound thing that's particular to this moment. In maybe the same way I sort of think about it as when radio became ubiquitous in American households. We had sort of a similar crisis of discourse when that happened, and there were enormous issues with misinformation and people hijacking the political conversation that like came out of nowhere when radio came into everyone's household. And like we're living in a similar moment, potentially a more profound moment when it comes to the rewiring of discourse, political discourse in particular.
Particularly relevant to like Jackson specifically, and how much outdoor recreation culture is shaped by video, and then therefore like shapes how we interact with our landscape. So
yeah,
there's a lot
the
there.
whole outdoor industry is a visual industry, always has been.
So yeah, just to keep moving here, I'll move on to question number 3. Also a 2-part question.
Okay.
So a little bit of background is just that here at NRCC, we've always sort of promoted an interdisciplinary approach to environmental work. And that sort of what you already sort of spoke about, in that what we have always sort of traditionally called environmental problems are actually more precisely just human problems of decision making and value conflicts, all the sort of human issues that we face in all of our forms of organization. And so we sort of promote an approach that requires like self-awareness and contextuality within your work. So my first question is, and maybe this relates to your work in TENSLEEP or other places, but how do you seek to be interdisciplinary and contextual in your work? And then more broadly speaking, how have you felt that you were most effective within the different spaces of your work over the years?
Yeah. Those feel like slightly two different things for me, the contextuality and the interdisciplinarity. I think like the contextualness feels like something that is like more like internal, having to do with like my standpoint in some way, and like my own self-awareness, whereas the interdisciplinarity side of that feels like active action of like physically bringing multiple perspectives into the room, or multiple like disciplines together, not just passively but like actively toward some imagined goal. So like the contextuality, just like, am I aware of how I'm situated in this stuff? I think like when it comes to academia, I would I think credit Susan Clark, who like started NRCC and is a mentor of mine, with I think opening my eyes to the dynamics at play in academia these days, and sort of how I either fit in or don't fit in. And you know, a good example is just like the whole first question about how I fit in, what I do, and like sort of my interpretation of my role as this conduit between academia and the public. I think for me to say that requires the knowledge that like academia is set up in this particular way these days, that it is disconcerned with the humanities and mostly concerned with like studying technology and things that will be like useful to the capitalistic system that we like sit in right now. That private companies are funding research all over the place, that the funding of academia is kind of all out of whack right now. I think people that are like, this is sort of hypocritical, but like I kind of think that academia is all out, like screwed up right now in many ways that we probably don't have time to talk about here right now, but it's interesting to go into a field where like I know I don't totally fit in many very profound philosophical ways, but that like the broad goal of academia, or the original goal of academia, I really do not agree with, I guess, but like I know that my strengths as a human in this world, given my background, are actually like suited really well for. And going to a place like Yale too, which is just like a different level of academia, not like hierarchical in terms of like knowledge creation or generation, but like
Mm.
power is also uh, it's super important to recognize and know. Um, I think like, you know, I could talk about my context in Jackson, but
How about
it,
sleep? I would be curious to like how you navigated that gap between academia and being a person interested in a remote rural town in Wyoming like Tensley.
um, well, I think the first thing is that like not good to mention that you're a Yale researcher off the top, right off the top,
Yeah.
when you're working in spaces like that,
Mm,
and just like honestly, just like relating to people
mm,
uh, as people to start, um, and and yeah, it turned into a really funny project. I mean, really quickly, like I started the project thinking I was going to research rock climbers.
mm,
It very much it quickly turned into uh, me, I think, growing to not hate would be maybe a strong term, but really resent rock climbers, of which I am a part. So like resenting myself in a way, really falling in love with people intensely,
mm,
and the town. Um, and I think watching myself grow to identify with the 10 sleepers and their conflicts in dealing with the rock climbers that were moving in.
mm,
And I don't know if that makes sense without me explaining the whole project,
mm,
but this environmental conflict had grown up in or popped up in a national forest outside of Ten Sleep, Wyoming.
mm,
Rock climbers were totally unregulatedly just developing trails in the area, rock climbs in the area,
mm,
you name it, with no consultation with the Forest Service, taking over the small town. At one point, 2 summers ago, there were 600 rock climbers in the canyon. The town of Ten Sleep is 260 people, so there were like 2 times the amount of rock climbers in the area than residents.
mm.
Um, and yeah, it was. I could watch my sort of like context and positionality shift throughout the project, which I think is good.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know
Okay.
if that makes sense or it specifically answers that question.
No, I think
Um,
it does. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, it's just fascinating to see how to think about like how an outside researcher can navigate all these different spaces and how you can fit into them and not fit into them, and then therefore how do you communicate an honest sort of look at these at local communities. And I think that's a question many sociological researchers worry about and are concerned about, but was just curious to see how that was an experience for you intensely.
yeah, yeah, it was a wonderful project, and I think like
Mm,
in terms of context and like some of the values that I think I've been brought up in, like
mhm,
maintaining a level of self-awareness through that project, like
mm,
maintaining a self of reflexivity or maintaining reflexivity of myself and watching myself shift as
mm.
a objective observer of what was going on or whatever, is super was super important too, to
Gotcha.
see that like by the end I could feel it in myself that like I wanted to defend this town,
Mm, mhm,
and like that's like the thing that I think people who are just wading into or have like an outside view of like what science is are really afraid of in researchers and academics, where it's like, yeah, well, all climate scientists are just like liberals, and it's like that's true. Actually, it's generally true. uh, and like that doesn't discredit the generation of the best knowledge we can create. That
mm,
like in that project I wasn't trying to create I mean, I was trying to create the best knowledge I could, but it wasn't like a claim to like total objectivity all the time. It
totally.
was like, hey, I'm gonna like try to do my best. I'm like trying to be as reflective as I can, and like uh I'm gonna have issues myself in this project,
Mm,
and different sort of um you know moments of bias and
mhm,
and and the important thing is not for me to have a pretense of me creating the most objective knowledge because I'm a Yale researcher, but it's to be like self-aware and like public with that process that I'm going through.
Seems to require a good level of humility in that situation.
Yeah.
So keep moving forward, we're going to move on to question 4. And this, I think this will be interesting to see how you answer this compared to maybe some of our later speakers. But just looking at sort of the moment we're in, sort of 50 years since the environmental movement started in 1970, sort of the question is like, how has your understanding of that movement changed since you either started participating of it or just sort of learned what environmentalism is? And then how effective do you think we are being in that movement? And if you have any thoughts about what can be done or just like where we should move forward within, because I think, I mean, Joe Biden just releases like $2 trillion climate plan. Like we are moving into a different future. So I would be curious to just hear your reflections on the movement at large.
Yeah. I mean, I was born in 1991. So like literally the IPCC report has been going on the entire time I've been alive. So, I mean, my whole life, people have known about sort of this catastrophic potential direction of the planet, which is like an interesting thing just to know about like me in the course of history. I didn't grow up knowing anything about environmentalism. Like I think the normal path, I don't want to make a normative statement here totally, but like in my experience, a lot of people, I don't know, the normal story might be like, yeah, I like grew up hiking a lot and like, you know, my parents were in the environmental world or whatever. And I just kind of like came into this sort of space. And I don't know, my mom was like you know, she actually did a lot of various things in a constellation around justice, but like did a lot of research and advocacy around the death penalty while I was growing up. And I didn't go to camp in the summer. I mostly grew up playing video games and like, but I think what was at the core for me, and like, I'll get to like what I think about the environmental movement, but I sort of fell into this work and it wasn't a clear path. And I fell into this particularly because it feels to me that some of the most profound, like genuinely profound questions about this planet, and like particularly the most profound questions about the period of time that I will live on this planet are in the environmental world, basically, or the environmental movement or whatever. And it's sort of the same reason that I fell into like neuroscience. I thought there were a lot of really profound philosophical questions around the brain, and I just kind of like fell out of love with that at one point. And the environmental movement really wrapped me in. There are a lot of really, really profound questions that are going to determine the fate of everything, basically, which comes down to this sort of, this is particularly about the environmental movement, but that the environment, I think, is sort of a misguided concept to begin with. The environmental movement, which I think people would understand as like activism around natural resource use or misuse, you know, starting back in the Vietnam era, but also before that, yeah, is like kind of a bizarre concept. It's like not really a concept that's super useful. These are like, it's like everything and nothing at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense. It's like, you see it at the School of the Environment at Yale, where we have people from all these different disciplines. There's economists, there's sociologists, there's lawyers, there's, you know, Susan, who's like a wildlife biologist policy person, all in this under the same roof. And it's like, what are we doing here exactly if we're all in these different disciplines? What is the overriding goal? And it's not clear to me that there is one right now exactly. And, you know, yeah, it's like if you think about it too much, it's a little weird. Like you can't be exempt from environmentalism, really.
Mm.
It implicates everything
Right.
all the time.
Mm.
And I think that right now uh, there's more like entanglement between environmentalism and other more sort of like questions of justice and politics than there has been maybe since its inception.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Which, yeah, but I could be totally off with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of that makes sense.
No, I think it does. I think we are definitely growing in our definition of environmentalism to include many, many different ways of thinking. And uh, maybe the goal is healthy environments and healthy people in the future, but like there are so many different ways to get there. And I think at a school like the Yale School of the Environment, people have very vastly different ways of thinking about how to do that. And so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the like moments that I think of when I think of sort of transformation, my own transformation in my relationship to the environment or whatever, is just like Susan Clark being like, there aren't really environmental problems out there. Like the point is not to go manage bears. The point is to like manage people because that's what we can control. Like in a sense, environmental problems aren't really a real thing or something we should be focused on. That like stuff's screwed up out there. It's like it is so clear. It's become so clear to me that like what is in our control is like managing ourselves. And really, when it comes down to it, like what is the biggest environmental force anywhere, whether it's in the GYE, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem here in Wyoming, or globally, like the biggest ecological force is humans. It's like it's almost so obvious that it's like stupid to say, but people I think start when they think about environmentalism are like, let's go manage goats.
Yeah.
And it's like, how about we like manage people?
Yeah.
So that the goats can do their thing and be empowered to do their thing.
It feels obvious, but it implicates a necessary framework to manage human expectation and values that we don't really have as like an easy concept to grasp right now. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all I really have thoughts about the environmental movement. But I know we're kind of like over time or whatever.
Yeah, we'll ask the last question, then we'll open up to Q&A. So the last question, just sort of a broad, and you can take this in any way you want, but what are 3 pieces of advice that you would like to give to the audience listening today and just the broader, greater world? And that could be strategies that you use or books that you read or people that have influenced you. Just 3 pieces of advice.
You told me you were going to ask me this, so I have 3 very specific things. The first thing is that everything is on YouTube, which is a double-edged sword. There is so much to be learned and understood on YouTube. It's hard to sift through the garbage, from like separate the garbage from like the good stuff. But there's so much out there now, on the internet broadly, but YouTube specifically. Being a visual person myself, it's just like I'm so happy to be alive right now, because of that. It's just like as an adventurous person, like in the physical space and idea space, it's like so wonderful to have that. The other thing is that the humanities, I think the humanities are really important. And not just because I think it's like art is cool, but specifically because I think that one of the failures of our democracy right now is a lack of imagination, both in what is possible in the policy world, but also our imaginative capacity to understand the real lived experience of our other fellow Americans, in the case of for me, that really to like have a functioning democracy, you really have to have like an empathetic capacity between your the constituents in order to really like you know, have humility in the population. And I think that the best way to learn how to feel with and feel for other people is the arts and humanities. And I think we're living in a total golden age, specifically of video. I'm going to keep talking about video, but like Netflix, like the amount of content that can open people up to new emotional capacities right now is enormous. And then the other thing is just, I think that the way that we're taught, the way that I was taught to work in the world was to mostly focus on external problems and issues and like fix stuff out there. And I think that over the past couple of years, I've really, you know, it might sound self-indulgent, but really like refocused internally on myself. I have a lot of like, I had and like will continue to have a lot of like insecurities and problems that were really at the core of my decision making about the course of my life. And becoming more aware of those insecurities, dealing fully with some of them, still working on others, I think has been a really important reframing for me as I like come into adulthood still. Still trying to be an adult. Not there yet. But to get better at separating, like, am I like pursuing this thing just because I'm like super insecure about like, for instance, my intelligence, which like I am sort of like, oh, I'll go get a degree from Yale. That'll like make me feel better. And it's like, am I doing that literally just for personal insecurity? Is that like good for me? Is that good for the world? I think just, I'll never totally be able to get rid of that insecurity, but you know, being more aware and being able to separate that sort of decision making has been really important for me over the past little bit. That's been my journey.
That's interesting. Yeah, that feels very honest and hopeful around new forms of communication, that the internet is here and we're going to have to learn to communicate through it. And there is a lot of possibility and opportunity. And it's cool that you recognize that and are like digging into it versus just wanting to like not pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you've ever spent any time in the comments section of a YouTube video, it becomes pretty clear that our like discourse and humility for one another is like just totally ruined right now as we become more digital creatures, as the human species further integrates with our technologies, which is kind of what's going on right now. The social process has been totally reformed.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jesse. That was all really insightful and interesting, and I think like new for me to even hear from you, who I know you really well. So thanks for that, all those thoughts. We're gonna move into a Q&A. We have about 11 minutes. So I see that there's several questions already in the chat box, but if you have more questions, feel free to type them in there and we'll try to get through as many as we can at this point. I see a question here, not quite sure how to frame it other than we're in the state of Wyoming, there's a pandemic happening and we're living in a tourism economy, and therefore we have a lot of people coming here, specifically in Jackson. The town is flooded with people. I read recently that we had 40,000 people here in the town limits that were from elsewhere in the last, on one day. So just, there's a question mark after that statement. So just wondering, what are your thoughts on the current state of affairs around tourists coming here to Jackson and the GYE?
I think like my mind, when it comes to this sort of thing, really quickly slips to like the just real pragmatic options that we have. I mean, there's a couple ways to go about it. You could like describe what's going on. You could like propose changes to policies, you know, and I think the like describing what's going on is like, Jackson exists with this level of like public funding and quality of life because of tourism. And the town promotes itself as a tourism place. The economy is completely set up. It's a tourism economy. And so like, I'm not sure what we can do right now during this. Like, people will suffer because of that. But like, I think it's important as we move forward to know that when there are more pandemics, which there will be in a globalized world like this, that like, uh, if you set up your economy in an undiversified way, primarily around tourism, you will get totally screwed. Like, there are other places in economies that are also getting totally, destroyed, or put in these it's like just a morally compromising position. Like, bad stuff happens in the world. This is a bad thing that is happening, and there probably isn't. This is not what like politicians should say, but like there probably isn't a good way out of this. There isn't like things that sometimes people want like there to be a good answer where it's like nobody's harmed, and it's like, no, we've like rigged our economy and system in a way that like people will be harmed if things like this happen. And I think like it's sort of a game of expectations. It's like expecting that not to be the case is crazy. That's like not a satisfying answer, but I think like what can we do? We can put in mask ordinances, which actually I'm here in town. It's like super intimidating to see so many people in town square or something like that, and people are mostly following the mask ordinances. And I'm just not sure that we could like shut down the economy here with no help from the state or federal government, which like the federal government could have done a better job being able to use the resources to situate towns like this in a way that's not devastating to the economy or health, but they didn't. And so like, what can we do? That's not like a super sad. Do you have thoughts, Ben?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my base thought is just like mask ordinance feels like bare minimum, and that we could be taking a lot more steps, even if we're going to open up the economy. Like, there are other tools that we have that we could do, and instead we're not using those, and we are just operating as sort of a status quo environment. We have seen other countries around the world do much, much more than a mask ordinance, and the rates have lowered. So like, I wonder, like specifically here in Jackson, is like, could we operate in a sort of fully functioning economic way, but then also impose regulations and limits and constraints, which is something that this town and this state doesn't like. So like, maybe that's just like not possible, but mask ordinance feels just like base, got to do it, and then you got to do other stuff. So
I totally agree. I think like if with things like this, it seems like we're too far in the direction of like expectations have been formed that like we can't go back. Like, if right at the beginning of this it was just like there was a plan in place, like and if things were clear, it might have been different, but we're like too far in this direction. The one other thing that I just wanted to mention with this is like, I don't know how to put this other than like, this is going to be what my life on planet Earth is going to be like. Like, this is what people talk about when they talk about like problems with an entirely globalized world and like climate change, is that my generation is going to be dealing with a ton of lose-lose situations, basically, in regards to like quality of life. And I don't want to like put that burden or like blame on anybody, but that's just the reality. Like, I need to train myself to expect more lose-lose situations, because that's like what happens when you just destroy natural resource bases. That like, life's not always good. Like, life's not always getting better, you know. It's not the end of history. It's not like so I think like grappling with that for me personally is like pretty real. Like, that's what people talk about when they talk about climate change. It's just like, things are going to get worse.
That really relates to the second question that I have here from the audience. Kind of a longer question. I'll try to get it out there. Basically, does this moment make you think that a majority of Americans understand the fix we're in relative to the environment, that being climate change, species loss, environmental regulation, and social injustice in terms of harmful exposure and lack of decision power? We see that all the time. And larger issues of social justice and governance, so we can make meaningful change. So Nicholas Kristof argued that there is hope, and it sounds like you have a different definition of hope. And I wonder what he said in a New York Times op-ed today. But given what you just said, we're going to be dealing with a lot of lose-lose situations, and therefore our expectations might need to change. Do you also have hope that positive change for the common good of all people in all life might happen? Like, is it possible to still have hope within sort of this framing of like, there are just lose-lose situations ahead for us that we're going to have to deal with?
Yeah, like I have hope in the sense that I don't think, similarly to the problemed logic of thinking that like history just goes like this or whatever, like it's like Obama's president, it's like great, like racism's gone or whatever. Like also, I don't think it's just like everything's gonna get worse like from this point on.
Mm-hmm.
I read something the other day about like, you know, right now in some ways feels like the start of something too. Like I think that there are really promising signs, particularly, I mean, I've been super pessimistic throughout this whole thing, this conversation about the internet, but like, it is a really profound tool and lived reality of our species now that like, we can make globally, we can communicate globally in an instant. we can create, you know, collaboration across continents, and in some ways we're set up better now technologically if we can hold on to this, you know, level of technological giftedness for more than another 10 years to create like a profoundly more empathetic and sympathetic and collaborative species and globe than ever before, really. And so I think in that sense I have hope. I do have a ton of hope. I think what when I sound pessimistic, I just tend to push back against the like, if we just do this, then things will get better. Like I'm more like in the camp of like, this is all going to be hard work, and like it's not all going to be good. And right now it feels like there's a lot of hard work with potentially enormous payoff to be done on our planet, given our situation. And you know, tough circumstances force people together. Sometimes it leads to war and a ton of death, and other times it doesn't. And so in terms of hope feels like a really like me-centric thing, and like, yeah, I'm hopeful. I don't know if that's like smart to be hopeful or whatever, but yeah, I'm hopeful for the future.
Yeah, it sounds like your vision has a good dose of pragmatic reality involved with it too. So
dude, I remember when I was in like high school, my best friend like in a derogatory way calling me a utilitarian, and so I know there's like a deep pragmatism inside of me.
Well, I think we're gonna have to end there. Jesse, thank you so much. That was
Thanks, Ben.
wonderful. I learned a ton, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. And appreciate everybody that came to the Zoom talk today, and everybody on Instagram Live. This is going to be happening every other Thursday from here on out for the next basically 3 months. Our next talk is going to be on July 30th with Dr. Rich Reading. He's the Director of Research and Conservation at the Butterfly Pavilion in Colorado and has been working in international conservation for 30 years, like a long, long time, and lots to learn from him. I know that his work has really been affected by COVID, so we might get a different answer next week, but just wanted to let people know that that's going to happen on July 30th at the same time. And yeah, thanks again, Jesse. That was awesome. Appreciate it. And takes a lot of courage to be the first one to go in this series. So thanks. And
thanks for including me.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I hope everyone has a good rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.